Thank you. Super excited to be here and with everyone who's joining us. I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation. We only have an hour, so I'm going to get us started. As she mentioned, we'll have time for Q&A towards the end, so please ask questions. That's often the most fun part of this 1 hour conversation. And we'll start with the ones that are upvoted the most first. So today's talk is going to be about executive presence. Again, my name is Yue. I've got a Substack that I write on career growth. It's Yue Zhao at substack.com. Please subscribe if you're interested in content like this. I've also got a Reforged course that's coming up in June, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But without further ado, a quick introduction about myself. So I'm a current career coach and I focus on mid to senior level leaders and helping them really break through from middle management into executive levels. Prior to this, last 15 or so years, I was in product. Most recent job was Chief Product and Technology Officer at Fuzzy, which is a pet telehealth company. And I also wrote a book recently on this exact topic of career growth and helping people break through to the C-suite. My career spans a wide range of companies from Meta to Thumbtack to McKinsey. And if you're interested in me learning more about me and coaching in general, my website is www.yuezhao.coach. You can find out everything about myself and the coaching, as well as a bit more about my Substack and Reforge there. Kind of a hub for everything. All right. So executive presence. What is executive presence? It's one of those keywords that's like being more strategic that everyone calls out and sometimes get on their performance feedback and then they go, what does that mean? And how do I actually work on it? To me, executive presence really refers to the ability of someone to command attention. This is really the presence piece, right? To when they walk into a room, when they're in a particular group meeting, they command the attention of the group. And then they inspire trust. And from that trust, they're able to influence others in the meeting. That's where really the executive piece comes in, is this ability above everything else to be able to influence the direction of a conversation, to be able to influence or make a decision that someone else might not be able to make. And to be able to facilitate a conversation that's super productive and sort of above and beyond what others are able to do. And so we're going to kick off a poll from this group. I know we have quite a few people joining us. I'm curious to hear from the group kind of what attribute do you think is most important for executive presence? It's not an exhaustive list, but I listed a couple here. Curious to hear from the group what they think is the most important attribute when it comes to executive presence. All right, see, we've got some top votes for confidence, some high votes for integrity and eloquence. Perfect. Looks like that's where we're roughly netting out. Confidence is definitely a huge factor when it comes to executive presence. Very interested to see that integrity ranks number 2 from the group. Sort of integrity, authenticity, very much I would call it like a new element that in the last 10 years has come up as one of the more important aspects of leadership. So very, very happy to see it there, and eloquence for sure as well. So we'll actually get into, not meant to be a trick question, but executive presence is a combination of all of these things. And actually, depending on the type of company you're in, the type of culture that you're in, it does vary what is more important, what is less important. And that's specific to the culture and the environment that you are in. But all these sort of make up a holistic umbrella of executive presence. And we'll go into each one. So first bucket that you have is really around what I call presence. This is your gravitas. This is how you look. This is your appearance. This is how you command the room. This is basically if I take out everything else about you, if I just played a soundless image of you in the room, what does that look like? And how do you hold the room? The second is around communication. So this is your voice. This is what are you saying? How are you saying it? How are you including others in that conversation? And then the third is really, I call it influence, but it's really around your ability to make a decision, to inspire confidence, and to be empathetic to others. We'll go into this a little bit more in depth later, but this last bucket has more to do with the things you do outside of a particular room, outside of a meeting, than within it. The first two are very much things you control within the meeting, right? How you look, how you communicate. The last bucket is everything that you've done, all the work that you've done, all the relationships that you've built before going into that room, before going to that meeting and that decision that needs to be made. All right, so let's dive into presence. Well, the first thing about presence is about being present. So I sort of break this up into in-person versus over Zoom, since we are over Zoom and it's becoming a much larger portion of either hybrid or remote work these days. When it comes to being in person, taking up space in the room itself, making sure that you're not sort of sitting back in your chair, making yourself look small somewhere in the back of the room, like take up space at the table. Second, using hand gestures, right? This works, and you'll see this over Zoom as well, where when you speak, take up more space when you're speaking. Use your hands to take up sort of the air and the surrounding space around you so that you are more in the conversation and people are aware that there are things that you're saying. The last is really like, if the conversation feels stale, if it feels like the group is not getting anywhere, getting up, standing, going to a different spot in the room, or as it makes sense, using a whiteboard to help drive a conversation forward. Even if you're not necessarily the person facilitating, if the conversation feels like it's at a point where it needs a driver and needs to move forward, you may be able to sort of quote unquote ask for permission or ask for the ability to help facilitate and drive the conversation forward by going to the whiteboard. Getting up and moving around the room also helps attract some visibility to you, as well as sort of change the dynamics in the room a bit. When it's over Zoom, the first thing is really looking into the camera. So this can be a hard thing to do, but the trick that I think works for many of us is to move the participant box up near your camera, wherever your video camera is, moving your little box up near it so that when you're talking and looking, right now I'm looking at Eleanor, for example, I'm looking at my webcam as much as possible. The second is making sure you take up a good percentage of your Zoom window. I've seen people who join Zoom who are like very, very little and tiny, and you can barely see them and their face is half cut off. That's not going to work super well when you're trying to be more present or trying to command the room. It may be okay if you're simply participating or listening. Make sure you try to take up at least 60% of your Zoom window, like so that you are a larger figure on people's screens. And then lastly, try to wear contrasting colors with your background. If you know what the background is coming in. So, I've seen people who wear similar colors, like white on white or black on black, and then essentially they fade into the background. So, always have something handy if you can, like a jacket or a scarf, that, if you go into a Zoom meeting and you're like, wait, I pretty much blend into the background, you can quickly swap something on. And make sure that you stand out from the background itself. The second around really appearance is you can use how you dress to counterbalance certain stereotypes. Again, you can tone this up and down depending on what the stereotype is and what you need to balance. So for example, you can opt for sort of more colorful, louder clothing that helps you stand out if you tend to sort of blend into the background, if you're not really noticed all the time. Vice versa, if you tend to stand out too much, you may want to tone your clothing back a bit so that you are as loud or obvious in a conversation. The second, if you're trying to be more assertive, many times, myself included, as an Asian female, I'm not really viewed as the most assertive person in the room. And so I often avoid soft, cuddly materials that make me feel even more cuddly and warm, because that's not a trait that I need to necessarily hype up. And so I avoid wearing, they're super comfortable at home. I love cuddly sweaters, nothing against them. But when you're trying to have more executive presence, when you're trying to, facilitate a conversation, wearing something that is, again, more formal, having heavier materials, can help you feel more assertive and also seem older in terms of how you appear. So there are many things that you can do and play with in terms of how you wear, what you wear, how you wear it, that allow you to, on the margin, go one direction or the other in terms of how you appear during meetings. Next, we'll talk about communication. Oh. All right, so in terms of communication, we just talked about sort of how you look, how you appear. Communication is all about how you sound. So I can turn off my video, and that's going to be the piece that we're talking about right now. The first is really around speaking with a strong and confident voice. And so this works really well. The first example and tactic works really well if you're in person, but also works if you're over Zoom. So imagine you're trying to project your voice to a point on the wall further away from you. So if you're in a room, it might be the wall, at a distance across the table. If you're on Zoom, it might be the wall behind your screen. I've actually had people set up their desk such that the wall is not behind their desk, but that they're in the middle of the room and the wall is 20 feet from where they are. And then ask them to sort of project their voice to that further wall. When you're doing that, your voice comes more from your stomach rather than your throat at that point, and that makes it deeper and more confident. The second is ending your sentences with a falling pattern. So many of us have a habit of ending our sentences with our voices going up, like a question. And so when you're making a statement, it often sounds like a question. I'm going up. Instead, when you want to sound more confident, when you want to have more presence, you want your voice to go down. You want every statement to conclude. And so it is something you can practice. And when you listen to yourself, if you record yourself and then listen for how you tend to end sentences and practice ending it with a falling pattern. The last tip I have around this is really around what you can do before starting the conversation. It helps to just have motion, whether it's yawning, stretching, laughing, doing something different with your face muscles right before you go into a conversation helps relaxes everything. And when everything is more relaxed, it also helps you be more confident during the conversation. Another thing that I think many of us have heard that I like to expand upon is filler words. So we've got a little comment here that says, okay, so listen, the thing is, well, I'm just saying, maybe it's just me, but I mean, here's the thing, I could be way off, but look, we all say this. I just said right? But try to minimize, especially when you are, again, in an important conversation, these types of filler words so, things. Some of us also like to, when we're not sure, use qualifying statements before we jump into a statement. We say things like, I thought that maybe if you guys are up for it, maybe we could do this. Just jump into the comments, right? Rather than using statements up front. There are some people who also like to apologize unnecessarily. Sorry if this is off topic. Sorry, but I really want to mention this. Sorry, XYZ. No need to say sorry. Jump into the statement. To start with the statement. And then there's a group of us who love self-deprecating comments. I think I see Eleanor smiling because I think she's heard some of these. I'm so bad at this may not be right. Like, you've already contradicted yourself before you started talking, right? You said, this may not be right, but here's what I think. So why would I listen to you if you told me this may not be right? And so avoid these types of leading statements that really don't add any value to the comment you're about to make. If you have to, make it in your head first. Say it in your head quietly to yourself, and then force yourself to start with what it is that you want to say. And again, this takes practice. If it's a habit that you need to break. It takes time. And so the first step is really becoming aware of it. Again, recording yourself really helps in this aspect, or having someone in a meeting with you look out for you and say, hey, can you help me and let me know after the meeting how many times I may have said these types of things. So awareness is really the first step. And once you're aware of it, you'll actually go through a phase where you feel a little bit awkward. And you may even say it more often because you're aware that you're supposed to say it. And then you say it, and then you're like, oh crap, I wasn't supposed to say that. That's okay. That's a step in the right direction. Eventually, with more practice, you'll get to a point where you can start removing these types of leading statements and self-deprecating comments out of your conversation. All right. So another way of really showing more presence and executive presence when you're communicating is what you're actually talking about. Many of us early in our careers are taught to make sure that you're in the conversation. And so these are really what I call participatory inputs, right? You're building on someone else's point. Maybe you're asking a clarifying question. Maybe you're offering an additional resource. These are more input type statements, and they're not as perceived as leadership type statements. Instead, what you want to do is look for ways to contribute that move a conversation forward. And so I have a couple of examples here. There are many more examples than this, but this is a couple of good starting points. The first is suggesting an alternative format. So if it feels like the conversation is getting to a point where people have given input, but it's not moving forward, and you still need to make a decision, you can suggest things like, how about we do a quick poll around the room? Who thinks A versus B? How about we all take 5 minutes to think about X and whether X is something we want to do, and then we come back and do a quick vote. You're suggesting a way to move the conversation forward. Another example is bringing in others who may have not spoken up, right? Being the person to actually say, hey, Jane is an expert in X. I want to hear what she thinks. That puts you in the position of more of a leader rather than a participant. And at the same time, you're bringing in another voice that you think is valuable to the conversation. A third way of doing this is where you actively help avoid rabbit holes. So, this is not a critical point. How about we parking lot it and we come back another time, right? Being the person, again, to move people forward and saying, that's a great point, but it's not what we need to decide right now. So let's come back to this later. And then lastly, helping summarize. And again, with the eye towards moving the group forward, saying things like, hey, to help summarize, we've discussed XYZ, we've agreed on A, now we need to decide on B. Let's talk about B as a group. Again, you may not be the primary facilitator of that meeting, and so it may be about finding the right time, and it may not happen every meeting for you to step in and be able to help drive the conversation forward. But more often than not, I don't know about you, but when I was working, there were plenty of meetings that I was in. I was like, okay, this meeting needs to move forward. Like, we need to make a decision. Something needs to happen here. And it is okay for you at that point to step in and say, all right, suggest an alternative, summarize and move the group forward. And you'll realize that to do any of these well, you have to be actively listening. You have to be following the flow of the conversation. You have to remember who said what, and what has been talked about, what has not been talked about. You can't be a passive listener, doing something on your phone and then hop in and say one of these things, because more likely than not, you will not be on point. And so what's implied behind this, all of these things, is that you are an active listener in that conversation, and then being able to build on top of that to move the group forward. All right. So before I go a little bit further, I wanted to do a quick plug for my course, which is called Breaking Barriers for Managers to Executive. Its inaugural pilot edition in June 6th, and it is about executive presence, self-advocacy, securing sponsorship, building coalitions and influence. And it covers the content from this particular talk is taken from a portion of the course, and there's many more topics like this. one of my favorite topics that we cover in the course is about nurturing your superpower, which is really around finding something that you're amazing at and your strength, and being able to build on that as you accelerate towards leadership. So if you're looking for a way, if you feel like you need a way to grow your career and you're looking to get to that director, VP, C level, then these are the skill sets that you really need to focus on in addition to your day-to-day work to really build that platform and that trajectory that you need. So I recommend checking it out and signing up if it is of interest. All right, so getting to the third bucket here, which is really around influence. So we talked about how you appear, we talked about how to communicate, much more to say on those topics, but I wanted to get into influence real quickly. Do you know what gets you noticed more than anything else in a meeting that will get you that executive presence? It's when others actively defer to you for a decision. I'm not sure how many of you have been in a conversation, and it could be either you or someone else, where there's a decision that needs to be made, there's something that's going around, and all of a sudden someone says, what does Yue think? What does Eleanor think? That is the most powerful thing that you can make happen during a meeting that will give you that implied leadership and presence, executive presence within that meeting. But the question is, how do you make that happen? I mean, I guess you could plant it in advance and ask one of your friends to ask you, but it needs to happen sort of more informally. And so there's a few things that needs to happen in advance of a meeting or a particular conversation that really builds your foundation for that particular meeting. So the first thing is really around doing your homework. So understanding the topic, understanding what's being discussed, having an expertise or knowledge in the subject matter and the topic at hand is important. Making sure you've read the pre-reads, making sure that you know what the trade-offs are going in and what clarification questions you have. So there is unfortunately no amount of dressing properly or watching how you talk that will make up for really doing your homework in advance and knowing what to expect coming into the conversation. The second is around listening and hearing others. This is about empathy. There's empathy you can express within the meeting, right? We talked in communication about facilitating the conversation. That involves a lot of listening and hearing others and empathizing with people's points real time. There's also empathy that you develop outside of the conversation with relationships. And so when you have a habit of listening and hearing others outside of a meeting, that characteristic will carry into the meeting. And so I rarely see someone who, isn't very empathetic outside of a meeting come into a meeting and all of a sudden become very empathetic. Like, that's not a thing. And so it's a skill set that really carries through and starts with listening and hearing others on a regular basis outside of the meeting and being known as someone who is always ready to hear feedback, who is open to feedback and criticisms, positive criticisms, and is always listening to different perspectives. That attribute will carry itself into a meeting, and people are much, much more likely to give you time to talk when they think you've heard them, rather than if they think that you're just trying to talk over them. And the last around here is building relationships. Now, this is probably a topic that's hours upon hours in of itself, but it's, again, a very important aspect of what happens in the room, right? If you have strong relationships with everyone around the table, if you know potentially what their perspective is on that topic coming into the room because you've had a one-on-one with them, or you've talked to them about this particular topic in advance of a meeting, you're more likely to be able to influence what they think as well. Influence is really, people think of it as a one-sided thing, but it's really two-sided. It's like saying influence is like connection. Both parties need to be involved equally. And so when you want to have quote unquote executive presence, when you want to have the ability to command a room, the underlying aspect of that is having influence with others that are at the table with you and having solid relationships with others around you. And so one example of this is that you may want to sometimes consider the attendees who are in the room. if you have control, let's say, I'll give you a tactical example. Let's say you're running a product review, right? And there's going to be 12 people in the room. You want to make sure that some subset of those people are people who you have influence over, who know you well. So you may want to bring a couple of people from your team. You may want to bring your manager. You may want to bring a leader that you've worked really closely with. If it's going to be a controversial meeting, you may want more people that you know, or at least know their perspectives rather than less. You don't want to feel like, one against many in that particular room. And so there are tactical ways, including how you set up a room, that affects, again, your executive presence on how much you're able to lead. I've also seen people who strategically will hold meetings where it's almost to demonstrate their executive presence to a leader who doesn't know them well. I don't have another way of putting it, but they hold a group meeting with people they know well that they have influence over. It's mostly a meeting for everyone to come in and nod heads and agree on a topic. But they'll invite, one or two leaders who are not currently really close to their work, but they want to build a relationship with, or they want to sort of impress a bit, and they'll invite those leaders to the meeting. Because then they'll see like, oh, Yue has a lot of executive presence. She has a lot of influence over this group, and she's very decisive, and she's very eloquent, and she can communicate and facilitate really well. And they'll have an example of seeing Yue doing this, even though it's a bit of a concocted situation. So again, building relationships very much either within the meeting or outside of the meeting is an important factor to consider when it comes to your overall executive presence. All right. We talked about this a bit. I've gone through sort of high level the 3 different buckets. There's much more detail. Again, if you're interested in the course, we go into each of those in much, much more detail. Then the question is, how do you practice? I believe executive presence and all the different components of it is very much a learnable thing. It is not one of those attributes like charisma, for example, that's often associated with executive presence, where some people may naturally have more or less of it. Executive presence is definitely something that you can practice, and again, something you can be strategic about and setting up forums such that it's in your favor. So a couple of tactics to throw out there. One is to just facilitate meetings more often, right? To give yourself more opportunities to practice. Maybe when one of the leaders on your team is on vacation, you can help them facilitate certain meetings that they may do regularly. Maybe you can be the backup facilitator in large decision-making meetings. Often, people who are going into, for example, large product review could use the support of someone in case the conversation doesn't go the right direction, to help keep it on track. The second, as I've mentioned, is use all the new tools out there that are available to record yourself talking and giving a presentation and review it afterwards. I know it sucks. I hate listening to myself talk sometimes as well. I've gotten past it, but it is very, very helpful to just listen to yourself, look for fillers, look for comments you make, look for where you tend to be soft, see how you really show up in a particular Zoom conversation, and try different ways of improving it. The third is enlisting a friend. So in addition to, or instead of recording yourself, you can have a colleague of yours pay attention to how you facilitate, how you express yourself, and give you feedback afterwards. People love having a thing to do in the meetings, especially if they feel like they're only going to have 1 or 2 participatory comments. Something that helps them be engaged and stay engaged is also to pay attention to the things that you're asking them for support with. It also gives them awareness of what they're doing as well. And so it really does benefit both individuals. And so when you're asking for the favor, don't think of it as like, oh, I'm really asking it from somebody else. It helps them as well, because when they're paying attention to what you're doing, they start thinking about, am I doing this thing as well? And it can definitely go both ways in terms of the support. And you can also switch off as well from meeting to meeting. And then the last I'll say is, executive presence isn't something that only applies at work. It can apply to many different aspects of your life as well. And so if starting to practice at work can feel awkward, I saw how some people come to me and be like, look, I've been at this company for 5 years, and there's a certain reputation that I have. There's certain things that I do that I don't do that it feels really awkward for me to just show up and do something completely different one day. And so they feel much more comfortable trying it somewhere else first. So maybe you volunteer, maybe you go to church, maybe you're a part of improv or sports group, maybe you want to start a TikTok channel that you have 2 followers on, whatever it is. Um, you can always try doing it somewhere else first. If you don't want to lead a work meeting, maybe try to do something for your volunteer organization or your sports group instead. You can always try it out in a different forum and bring the relevant learnings with you into the professional setting. And especially if it may feel a bit awkward at the beginning. And over time, as you gain more confidence elsewhere, it'll also help you translate that presence and confidence into the workplace. All righty. I wanted to hop into Q&A. I see lots of Q&A questions. So I'm excited to start answering. I'm going to actually stop sharing as well.
Great. Yeah, we received a lot of questions. Just a reminder to everyone, even if you don't have specific questions, take a look at the Q&A and upvote the one you're most interested in. This is going to help us prioritize. We'll probably won't have time to cover all of them. So yeah. Okay, so I'll get started with the one with the most upvotes right now. Okay, there's one with 17. So interested in the Polish book, having worked with very casual C-suite executive, would you look to fit, like, does your look have to fit with how other C-suite executive who tend to be like very casual, yeah, does it have to be the same? What's your thought on that?
It's a great question. So there's definitely been a trend in the last 10 years towards like a clean, polished look, right? Whether you look at Steve Jobs and how he used to dress, whether you look at Zuck, Sundar Pichai, you Google any of the famous Silicon Valley executives and you see them in sort of either very clean, dark jeans, light t-shirts, blue sweater type thing. I have 2 thoughts about it. So the first, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish, right? For many minorities, actually, I often recommend that they dress like their executives because you want to be thought of as a part of the in group. And you want to not minimize differences, but you want to like have some of their halo effect rub off on you. And so more often than not, my recommendation is dress like them, especially if you're comfortable with it. They tend to be pretty comfortable clothing. And so if it's not offensive to you in some way, if it doesn't, isn't some culture belief that you have, then very much, be a part of the in group so that you minimize the amount of difference and people start viewing you as another executive at the company. At the same time, for some people, it's about needing to stand out, right? They very much tend to blend into a group. And so I always laugh at this, but like when you see a group who all wear white t-shirts and blue jeans, you kind of tend to blend in, right? And so when you want to make it known that you are in that group or you're someone that you want people to listen to, it can also help to wear something completely different, not in an offensive way, not in a like, vulgar or whatnot, but sometimes, particularly for women, dressing in brighter colors and dressing with more accessories can actually help you stand out and command the room better. Because you're going to stand out anyways. I've been in many situations as, the one Asian female in a group of 30. And so I'm going to stand out anyways. I might as well stand out a bit more and show my personality and make it known that I am here and that I am happy to be here and I'm looking forward to engaging with everyone. So I would say it really depends on the goal that you're going for and what in your specific case needs to happen and how your parents can help you do that.
Thank you. Okay, looking at the next question. Okay, this one got 30 upvotes. How do you balance authenticity versus forcing a lot of these points around presence?
It's a great question. I think first and foremost, one of the most important components of executive presence is authenticity, right? It's bringing your whole self to work. And I very much believe in that. At the same time, I also believe that as individuals, I think of them as dials. I think it was Yue Zhao who wrote about this first, and it really resonated with me. Um, for many different attributes, there are dials, introversion versus extroversion. For the most part, I'm actually an introvert, but I can dial up my extroversion for events like this and for social gatherings as needed. It's tiring if I have to do it for too long, but I can dial up certain traits. Um, I think of certain elements of executive presence similarly. Again, on the extreme ends of the spectrum, don't do something that's not you, right? If you really don't want to wear jeans and everybody else wears jeans, don't wear jeans. But for the most part, for many of us, many of these things are on a spectrum. And so if you tend to be more quiet naturally, it doesn't mean that you always prefer to be quiet. You can dial up sort of your loudness, if you will. You can dial up your assertiveness based on the situation. And again, if you're not naturally assertive, then it may be pretty tiring to always be assertive. So it's important to pick and choose your battles. But many of us have these dials within us that I think of that you can dial up and down for a particular situation. I don't think there's parts of this when it comes to executive presence. I actually don't think there's many traits where it can feel sort of against a culture or a value that you're brought up with. This actually comes up a bit more in topics like self-advocacy, where people feel like they're bragging. And bragging is very much not a value that they have. And there's more of it feels non-authentic to be, talking so much about themselves. Versus in executive presence, a lot of it comes down to confidence. A lot of it comes up to being inclusive. And I think many of those things are very much just natural traits that all of us have. And I think there's actually less of a clash with being your authentic self when it comes to the skill sets within executive presence. I'm curious to hear from this person again as a follow up, either maybe here or elsewhere, if there's a specific trait or a specific skill set that they find that's difficult to be authentic with, because I love to focus in on a specific example.
Yeah, you can hear me, yeah?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Perfect, sweet. Yeah, for sure. I think like for me, some of the points that you made, like like let's say just even speaking to my camera on Zoom. Sometimes when I'm in deep thought, I just have this weird habit of like looking away from the camera. And I feel like that's so me. Maybe it's a bad habit that I have, but sometimes in some of these things, I'm just thinking like, oh, that feels like it's authentically me. I just do that. That's who I am. Is there something that I need to change in order to have more executive presence, or is that kind of like losing, who I authentically am? It's tough for me to know that balance specifically, and I do know that when I try and force some of these things, it absolutely comes off the wrong way. Is probably the main thing. So I think it's probably for me at least just like a little bit more of being mindful of these things and how maybe that impacts my presence. But to your points, I really do think that authenticity is maybe more important than forcing them specifically. So
Yeah, I didn't even know you could join us, but so glad to have you, Denny. But yeah, no, I very much agree with that. So some of these I would say, so I fidget. I have a hair tie with me. You can't see it because it's off screen. I fidget a lot when I talk. And so I'm fidgeting, but you can't see it. I've practiced having it off screen so that, it doesn't detract. I think similarly, if you like to think and look away, I've also had people who, when they're thinking or when they're pondering something, they look like they're angry on the screen. And so, you see them in this giant screen and then they look very angry. And when all they're doing is really just thinking. So we all may have these habits. And it's really just that awareness of how it shows up to others and how you present it to others. And so maybe there is a balance between when you are thinking, you're looking away and that's normal. But when you have, gone through with your thought and you have something to say with the group, that you become more assertive. And so even during that same session, you may have times where you're a bit more set back and you're looking away and you're thinking and you're writing something down and you're contemplating things, which is totally okay. And then there's moments where you engage more with the group and you sort of like swap and you say like, okay, now I'm going to do this. And be more engaged and do the things like looking into the camera, for example.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Great conversation. Okay, we've got another question with a bunch of upvotes. Can you talk more about the balance with leading in a conversation, but also letting the facilitator do their job? And so how do you not like end up like driving the entire meeting? But also how can you balance that with giving feedback to the facilitator so they can also do a better job at controlling and moving the meeting forward?
Yeah, it's definitely a balance. So two thoughts. One is you can have a conversation with the facilitator in advance to be, I think I mentioned it as one of the tips, to be their backup facilitator should the meeting not go as well. So they actually know and are prepared for you stepping in to help. The second is really, again, monitoring the situation. You might get this wrong the first few times, and that's okay. Maybe pick and choose the meetings that you do this in. But usually a meeting will get to a point, or a conversation will get to a point where you'll get this intuition that it feels like it's taking too long. It feels like we're not making a decision. It's unclear what we're talking about and which topic we're talking about anymore. And that's a good point to jump in. If the facilitator is doing a great job and the meeting is moving forward and decisions are getting made and all good things are happening, then I wouldn't, right? That might not be the right meeting for you to step in and practice the skill set. It's really but for the most part, I don't know. I feel like a good amount of meetings I'm in could use a bit more facilitation and a bit more pushing forward. And then if you do jump in, remember to give the reins back. So I would facilitate in the sense that maybe I would move us one step forward, but rather than kind of keeping going, I would kind of look to the facilitator, to whoever was facilitating, to jump back in after that initial support, right? I would kind of give the reins back where possible. Sometimes it's not possible, and sometimes you end up facilitating the rest of the meeting, but make sure that you give chances for that person who was facilitating to continue facilitating. Rather than sort of co-opting the rest of the conversation and leading it forward. So it is really a balance. It's very much a balance. And that intuition of like knowing when to jump in, everybody's going to be a little bit different. Sometimes I urge people to maybe chat one of their friends. I mean, this may happen anyways. I know this happens to me where if someone's like, you're chatting your engineer, your designer, or someone on your team, be like, oh my gosh, this conversation needs to move forward. If someone is telling you that, that gives you a very clear signal that someone else is feeling the same thing. You can also kind of read, it's a little bit harder on Zoom, but you can read body language around the room and be like, are people engaged? Are they not engaged? It's just like one person talking for the last 5 minutes. There's lots of little cues that you can use to understand like, hey, does the conversation need to move forward? And then one last thing I'll say about this is that you can also privately message the facilitator and be like, hey, how's it going? Can I help? And see what they say. So if you're really not sure and if you really want to make sure you're playing it safe in a particular meeting, message them and be like, hey, maybe we should parking lot this issue. Do you want some support moving the conversation forward? In the private chat.
Great advice. There's another question about how would you take back control of the conversation without sounding domineering when someone in the meeting has an opinion about everything and is kind of like hijacking the meeting?
That's a great question. Again, it depends on your relationship with this person. And it depends on whether this is like that person's normal state, that they tend to hijack meetings and various different meetings, or this is something they're particularly passionate about. So there's a spectrum of things that you could do. One, the thing that I just mentioned, you can privately message that person and be like, hey, love your point, but it's taking up a good chunk of the conversation and I want to move this conversation forward, right? You can sort of just privately chat with them on the side. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is just calling them out if it feels like it's really been a long time and it's an intimate group who knows each other and you have a good relationship. That's the end of the spectrum. That's very informal, but it assumes that you have a good relationship with that person. some people even realize it themselves and be like, okay, I've been talking too long down this rabbit hole. Maybe we should go talk about something else. So, and then there's everything sort of in between. One thing that I think people hesitate to do is interrupt, especially women and minorities. We tend to get interrupted often. And so we feel less comfortable interrupting others because we don't want to be that person, right? That like did it to ourselves, to us in some other meeting. But when someone has been going on for a while and you have only a certain limited amount of time for the rest of the meeting and 3 more topics to get to, you need to interrupt. You need to interrupt because you need to move the group forward. And so I actually don't think it's impolite in those scenarios to say something like, hey, Eleanor, that's a great point. However, we've got 3 more topics to cover and we need to move the meeting forward. So I'd love to move us on to this next point if possible. We'll love to connect with you, after the meeting regarding this thing that you're very passionate about. Move the meeting forward, right? Because the rest of the group will thank you for it. Other than, but if they are making a good point, if this is something useful, again, I think there's a spectrum of how you can respond.
Yui, we technically at time, I can stay until the top of the hour if you're welcome
Yeah,
to.
happy to.
Yeah, there are a bunch of great questions. So if you have time, we can go through it. Cool.
Yeah.
There was another question about leading statements. Sometimes I want the team to explore more without me. What would be the right way to phrase the question?
When you want the team to explore more without you, I don't think I'm answering the question. I don't think I'm understanding the question.
I don't know if Aaron is still here. Let me see if he's still here, if he wants to. Okay, Aaron, you should be allowed to talk now.
Can I talk now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah, you said something along the lines of like don't say, oh, I'm not sure, don't take my word for it, but I think this is what we should do. And a lot of times I want the team to I don't want them to take my word on it. I want them to take it with a pinch of salt. I want them to go ahead and explore and maybe find a better solution to what I'm saying. So just how to correct that behavior of saying in advance, sorry, maybe I'm not the right person for this. And yeah, I'm turning that into a bit more of a positive statement, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I was talking about those filler statements or those self-deprecating comments, those are used in the context of really filling up space, and there isn't really value attached to them. I think in your scenario, the examples that you're giving, where you're purposely sort of hedging your answer or your statement because you don't want it to be taken as gold or as a command, right? That is different. That is positioning your statement in a way that allows someone to give you an additional perspective, give you feedback, and go to your point, like explore the topic further. In those scenarios, I would just say what the things that you've said, right? Which is, hey, I have an opinion. Here is my opinion. However, I'm not the most informed person on this topic, and so it would be great if the team, whoever's leading the project, can take this and do more research and digging to see if this is the right direction that we should go in. So it is okay. It is very much okay to not have 100% certainty in all your statements. The way I was framing more of the self-deprecating comments and the filler words is much more about just filling up space rather than making sure that a message is landing correctly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question is, how can you perform damage control after a meeting where you did not present effectively and now you're perceived as having weak influence or like not as much executive presence as you believe you can have?
Damage control, the fun things. We've all had this happen. Great question. Well, it requires rebuilding those relationships and it requires rebuilding trust. And more likely than not, you may have to have the meeting again. And so the things I usually recommend when a meeting sort of doesn't go as planned and it goes in a different direction, is to connect with the key people from that meeting one-on-one, and to realign you and them on what needs to happen in that particular topic. The second thing, once you have a sense of everybody being more aligned, is to bring the group back together, and perhaps with different stakeholders. And so rather than, let's say you had a one big group meeting with 10 people, rather than bring all 10 of those people back, you might want to have smaller groups of like 3 and 5 and have 2 of those or 3 of those first before you bring all 10 people back together again. Because everybody who walked out of that meeting also knows that that meeting didn't go well, also knows that the decision didn't get made. But I'm assuming that meeting happened for a reason. Everybody wants a decision to be made. So what they need to know is that it's moving forward. It's going to move forward. That's why the immediate connect one-on-one is very powerful. And what I even sometimes recommend is like messaging them, Slack, email, etc., to let people know like, hey, here's what happened. We didn't make a decision. I'm going to follow up. Expect me to reach out in the next couple of days, right? And then do the reach outs, have the smaller conversations, and then save the regroup for later if it needs to happen. And then I would index more on even more preparation for the next time the group meets, whether it's about this topic or another topic. The next time that you're in a large group conversation, do more preparation in advance to make sure that conversation goes well. Because most often it's really when it becomes a pattern that people get worried and it shows up more in their performance. And so avoid it becoming a pattern, right? Not only to rescue the first situation and make sure decisions are made, also make sure that you put in some extra work to ensure that it doesn't become a pattern. It doesn't become something associated with you over time.
Thank you. I love the next question we have. As a woman, how do you approach being confident and assertive with your male counterparts? Do you have any tactics for tuning it down but still commanding the conversation? For instance, often women can come across as aggressive, while in reality they're just passionate or assertive.
Yeah. I've been called intimidating before. I don't know how many of you on this call find me intimidating, but I've received feedback in some of my performance reviews in the past that I've been intimidating. And it's exactly this warmth versus assertiveness balance that is difficult to get right. Some of the things that I found helps. One is you can be very much assertive or passionate or direct about a particular topic that you believe in, but still be very open to feedback. So I often couch a lot of my statements or add to my statements. This is what I believe in. This is why I believe in it. Here are the data that backs it up. Does anybody have feedback? Does anybody have thoughts on this? And open it up for conversation. I find that by opening it up and giving others an opportunity and asking for that opportunity to give feedback kind of tones down the directiveness of it. And that it doesn't mean you have to change your mind, doesn't mean you have to go in a different direction, but just like opening that up. The other thing that I find is the balance of being like a group setting versus one-on-one, right? So if somebody knows you one-on-one, then they are much less likely to struggle with this balance. And so I find that I can be much more assertive in meetings when it's a meeting that I know everybody else outside of the meeting really well. And so I actually do spend a lot of time outside of meetings, building my relationships, building my influence, letting people get to know me, hearing thoughts so that I have a good relationship with them walking into the room. That allows me to actually be more assertive in the room itself because they kind of know who I am. And they also know if they want to call me out, they can. And so it's that difficult balance. And again, every culture is different. But it's definitely something that you can play with over time to figure out how you come off. And I think proactive feedback is a very important aspect of that cycle. So in my example, being called intimidating really threw me off. And I was like, okay, I really have a blind spot here on who am I intimidating to? And it turns out it's some of the more junior members of the team who don't know me as well. So, I may spend additional effort getting to know them. I may, in meetings with more junior members, be a little even more inviting and maybe a little bit less assertive in some of my statements so that I get the amount of feedback that I want.
I'm on mute. Great, thank you. I think we have time for one last question. When someone makes a bad recommendation in a meeting, I have the urge to jump in. What's the best way to counter the person without hurting their feelings and not derailing the meeting?
Yeah, I think it depends on how important it is to call out that it's a bad recommendation and whether you think the group is going to go down the path of that bad recommendation. So again, on a spectrum, on one side, you might have like somebody makes a bad recommendation, but it just kind of gets ignored because everybody thinks it's a bad recommendation anyways, in which case you don't have to do much. On the other end of the spectrum, the person who makes a bad recommendation is like the most senior person in the room, and everybody's like, oh, maybe we should go this direction. And then, 3 other people pile on, and you're like, oh crap, we should not be going down this direction. This is not the right direction, right? In that scenario, I think it is important to speak up. It is important to talk about why you don't think that it is the right path for the group to go down. And again, it also depends a little bit on, I just saw someone say, is this the hill we're dying on, right? Like, how important is the outcome of this decision to you? Again, if the more important it is, the more senior that person who made that wrong direction is, the more important it is for you to step up and say, okay, that's a very interesting direction. We've talked about it, or maybe we've talked about this before, but here are the reasons why this might not be a good idea, right? Or here are the reasons we may want to consider if we're going down that direction. So you don't want to necessarily come out and say, like, I think that's a bad direction. Instead, we can say, like, we can either say something like, we've thought about this before, and here are our concerns. Or you could say, here's if we do go down this direction, that's an interesting thought. Like, here are my concerns. And really just, keep the conversation going for a little bit and hope that you're able to surface your perspective on why that's not the direction we want to go down as a team.